Hello. The video that follows demonstrates real-time expense tracking by time and category in the Power Query Excel checkbook. It utilizes Power Query merge capabilities and applies some of its time functions. It also includes an Excel pivot table, pivot chart, and slicer. I hope you'll find it useful.
This is the 6th video in the Excel Power Query Checkbook series, and it demonstrates expense breakdown by time and category. But before we get into the breakdown, I'm back here at the Reconciliation tab, and I just want to add a button for the macro that is going to reconfigure the transaction sheet to reflect the balanced bank statement. To do that, I'm going to move to the Developer tab and grab a button here and draw the button. So this would be a good place to put it. And we have the Update Transaction macro. Click OK. And all we have to do now is label this. And that should be all we need. That allows us to run the update macro after we've balanced the checkbook. And now we can move on to the expense breakdown by time and category. To do that, we're going to merge a couple of Power Queries, and one of them is going to be based on the transactions table. So let's move over to the transactions worksheet and click anywhere in the table, and then from the data tab we will get a query from a table or range, and it will automatically default to the table that we have clicked in. We don't want to deal with the data types yet, so we're going to remove this change type, which came automatically. And now we don't want to deal with the totals row anytime we use this query. And an easy way to eliminate the totals row is to remove from the Pay ID column any empty rows. So if we just click Remove Empty, that should take care of the total rows. We'll rename this. And now we can set data types. And then we're going to save as a connection query only. So let's go ahead and set the data types. The date is definitely just a date. And let's see, Pay ID. I'm holding the Shift key down here. Description, memo, these are all going to be text types. Category is going to be a text. The type will be a text. And clear will be a text. So I'll hold the Control key down. Those will all be text. And the amount and balance, that can be either decimal number or currency. Let's put it at currency. And now we'll rename this to Set Types. And that will provide us with our transaction table query that we can use in future merges or appends. So let's go ahead and close and load to a connection. And we now have our table check connection only. The expense breakdown is going to need some date columns so that we can merge it with our connection only table check query. And that's going to come from a 3-year auto-adjusting query covered in another video, and the URL is shown. But I'm going to create that with the code. So from get data, from other sources, we're going to have a blank query. And in the advanced editor, I'm going to put the code in. No source data needed. It generates its own source data with the Power Query date functions. And click OK. I'm going to call this calendar 3-year. That's going to be a connection-only query. And now we merge those two queries to create our table breakdown. So we'll start by editing the table check connection only query. And now we're going to merge queries as new. We're going to use the 3-year calendar, connect with the dates, and click OK. I'm going to call this merge table breakdown. And now we just have to make a few adjustments to it. The first step is to filter the merge query to only expenses. So we'll come over to the type column and just keep the expenses. And since all the amounts for expenses are negative, we're going to add a column and change them to positive. We'll call this spent, and we'll take the amount and multiply by -1. Going to give that a currency data type. Now we can expand the date columns, and we're not going to use the original name. I'm going to keep the year, the month, the quarter, and the month name. There are many other date possibilities built into Power Query, but this will certainly be enough for us to track expenses. Click OK. And now we just need to keep the correct columns. So we're going to keep the date, we're going to keep the pay ID, we're going to keep the description and the memo and the category. We're going to eliminate the type and amount columns, remove those. Oh, we need to remove the balance as well. And the clear. Keep the year, keep the month, keep the quarter and the month name and the amount spent. And now we'll just do a little rearranging of the location of the columns. I think we'll get the spent after the category. Right there. And do a little renaming. Call this get expenses. Make expense positive. Set data types. Expand calendar. Clean columns. And reorder. Okay. That gives us our table to break down expenses. And we're going to close and load that. But this one we're going to close and load to a new worksheet, which by default we should get right here. We can see its table breakdown. At this point, we're going to call the worksheet breakdown. We're going to put it after the transactions table. And maybe just change the format a little bit. Well, since this is expenses, let's make it red. Now insert a pivot table to show by month. Put it on the existing worksheet. We'll stick it here. And the rows will be the month names. And the values will be spent. By default, it will be a sum. Let's use the value field settings to call this total spend. And the number format should be accounting. And now all we need is a category slicer and a chart. Let's go ahead and put those in. In the pivot table, well, let's go ahead and you make this month. We could, of course, add quarter if we wanted to track quarterly as well here. Let's insert a slicer. And we want a category slicer. And finally, let's get ourselves a chart. I think a standard bar chart will do nicely. We won't need any of the buttons. In the Analyze, field buttons will hide them all. We'll make those red. And where it says total, it will be expenses. And the axis options, let's show the numbers in thousands. And we'll have a counting format with 2 decimal places. Get rid of the legend. And the only other thing here, I think, is we're going to put a year in here, even though we're only dealing with 1 year at a time. So here in the pivot table, let's look at the field list and stick a year filter in. And that year will be the year of our transaction table. And we'll now link this year or this cell to a text box. So let's go ahead and in the chart insert a text box. We'll draw it here. We'll move it later. Click on the border equals the cell with the year. We're going to change the font a little to the 14 and not quite as black. We'll give it a gray. There we go. Okay. And now we can use the slicers to examine our expenses by categories. If we go down to groceries, we can see our grocery expenses by month, and we also see that accounting format 2 decimal places allows us to see the smaller expenses, so we don't have to see the large totals. So anytime we want to see expense patterns, we go to the breakdown table, refresh that, go to the pivot table, refresh that. And that's a real-time evaluation of our expense patterns. And now we can just go ahead and group the queries. So all of these can go into a breakdown folder. New group, we'll call it breakdown. And this also. And finally this. The final activity for the electronic checkbook is the archive. That's coming up.